The Hertfordshire Fire and Rescue Service is a medium-sized fire and rescue service in the United Kingdom which sits just above London. So in essence, Hertfordshire joins North London to rural East Anglia. So it's a combination of urban area and rurality, and that's exactly what we have in Hertfordshire. We have about 30 fire stations, ranging from retained, which is part-time firefighters, through to full-time staffed ones. Now, Buncefield is located in the southwest of Hertfordshire, where there are actually a significant amount of our resources, and is quite near to one of our busiest and biggest fire stations in Hemel Hempstead. So for most incidents we are well prepared in that area and have a lot of fire resources. However, whether we were prepared for Buncefield, perhaps only the history books will tell us. Buncefield as a site is a fuel storage depot. It doesn't process anything like some of the bigger sites you may find. It doesn't refine anything. It purely holds fuel, about 100 million litres of fuel, predominantly for either aviation fuel or for road transportation. It sits within 200 metres of the main spine road to the United Kingdom, the M1. The reason why this is important is that actually it became a big viewing attraction for the general public, and because you've got a big pall of smoke and a big orange glow, then people want to get as close as possible. And unfortunately, as close as possible at times was the M1. And we had people trying to park on the M1, a main motorway, 3 lanes of traffic in each direction. And so that was one of the reasons why we had to shut the motorway in the first instance, is actually to stop people parking and creating dangers to the traffic. Buncefield needs to be viewed as a crossover and a crossroads for pipelines in the United Kingdom. There are pipelines that come into Buncefield from both the northeast and the northwest, and indeed from Essex, which is actually only about 60 miles away. They collect all the fuel product and then redistribute it either by a direct pipeline to Heathrow, which is actually quite significant to the economy of the United Kingdom, or by road tanker to petrol stations for our cars. The reason I say the Heathrow pipeline is significant is because 40% of Heathrow's aviation fuel was supplied directly from Buncefield. And to suddenly cut off 40% of Heathrow, perhaps one of the busiest airports in the world, from its fuel supply was very significant. And I know for a period of time, I'm not sure how long, planes could not refuel at Heathrow, and they were having to take off and then land again at either Stansted or at another airport in Europe to refuel if they were going transatlantic. So there's quite a significant impact upon the transportation infrastructure of the country purely through this fire. Now, what was at Buncefield was a group of oil suppliers that came together in the one site. It wasn't owned by one set, or in fact it was owned by a set, but it wasn't owned by one fuel supplier. It was owned by 4, and they were BPA, which is the British Pipeline Association, Hossel, or Hertfordshire Oil Storage Limited, which was a loose amalgamation of Total and Texaco. Texaco had a site of its own, and British Petroleum. So there were 4 owner-operators on the site, and that did cause us some problems, because myself as the incident commander, when you want to speak to one person that's got authority and indeed a detailed knowledge of the site, it didn't exist, because there was 4 different companies on the site. That was a problem. Now, it didn't cause a problem in pre-planning, because there was a good committee structure where the oil companies came together, we sat with them and we discussed pre-planning, not a problem. But at 6 o'clock on a Sunday morning, when nobody's at work or nobody's in the office and you're trying to locate people, it does cause a problem. So certainly we've learned that in areas such as this, if you do have multiple occupiers, even if it's not oil, if it could be in a chemical plant, could be anything, then what happens in the emergency? So we do need to identify an organisation or a range of individuals that have the knowledge that we want. The damage that was caused by the initial explosion was quite extensive, and the reason I mention this is because the economic impact of this incident is still going on to this day. You probably need a good set of accountants and economists all in a darkened room for a long time to work out exactly what it means to the economy, but it's multi-millions, really is hundreds of millions of pounds on the economy. There are certain firms that have actually relocated, taken the opportunity and relocated outside of the United Kingdom. Fuji is an example. Fujifilm, which you'll see some photographs of, was completely destroyed, and they took the opportunity to move. They never came back, so that business was lost to the United Kingdom. So that's the type of economic impact that I'm talking about. There's obviously the immediate economic impact on the Hemel Hempstead area, but that was sort of an economic impact to the United Kingdom PLC. So how do we deal with incidents of this type? And of course it's all tied up with pre-planning, and we had pre-planned quite extensively on this site. We'd had 6 site visits in the previous 6 months with our local crews, and everything was in accordance with national guidance, our planning was to do with dealing with a fire in the largest tank. So we planned to deal with a fire in 2 tanks, which is what is considered to be normal for a fire service planning. And that meant there was a range of fixed foam installations on the tanks, installations for cooling tanks, foam equipment on site, bulk foam on site, there's water supplies on site, firefighting mains on site. Everything was there. Every single tank had a sheet, information sheet that told us what was the capacity of the tank, the type of fuel, how many foam firefighting jets you would need to extinguish it, the amount of water required. All these things were there. So we thought we were very well prepared for an incident on the Buncefield oil fuel terminal. I suppose what we hadn't done was envisaged that 20 tanks would be on fire in one go, and there would be an explosion, the equivalent of 2.4 on the Richter scale, that would devastate an area the size of a small town. That's what we hadn't pre-planned for, and I would suggest that nobody would have pre-planned for that, because it really was a scenario that nobody had thought about. Having said that, the fire service is designed to deal with whatever is put in front of it with the resources we have at hand. So that's exactly how we dealt with it. It can be seen from some CCTV footage exactly what the explosion was. Now, the explosion was 300 tonnes of unleaded fuel exploding in one hit. There still is some discussions going on about what caused the explosion, as in what was the ignition source. And although we are over 2 years down the line, that hasn't been officially determined yet, and there is a very eminent set of scientists still trying to determine what caused it, and also what caused such overpressures, because there's, in theory, there shouldn't have been an explosion of the magnitude there was, and the overpressures that were created were of such destructive forces that there are really are world-renowned experts still working to work out why. And I have had one of them state to me they believe it is a new science and they don't know why it happened. I mentioned the explosion. The blast damage, direct blast damage, was up to 3 kilometres away. With such damage 3 kilometres away was windows broken in, loft hatches raised, and when you get to within 200, 300, 400 metres of the explosion, we are talking complete destruction of buildings, as though a building had been picked up, shaken around and put back down again, with everything completely sort of destroyed, brickwork displaced, and if it was a modern type building, which is steel fabrication, steel cladding with insulation, they were just shredded, and you can see some examples of that in photographs. When the crews attended first, they were confronted with extremely difficult situation, and there's nobody, I would suggest, within the United Kingdom Fire Service, if not the World Fire Service, that have been confronted with such a situation. There are individuals and services that have been confronted with large fuel tank fires, even farm tank fires, even multiple tanks on fire, and there are services that have been confronted with extensive areas of damage through explosion. But to have both scenarios in one hit on a Sunday morning, we believe we were unique in what we had to deal with. Whilst also having the fuel tanks on fire and the devastation, we also had a very large building on fire as well as a result of the explosion, which was a building called the Northgate building. Now, in normal turn of events, that building would have been a significant and serious incident to Hertfordshire Fire and Rescue Service, and indeed any fire and rescue service. But because of the magnitude of the incident we were confronted with, it was almost lost to us. And I would suggest this is how any incident happens. If we are confronted with a one-room fire, we put all our resources into it and we'll deal with it very seriously, quite naturally. And if you're confronted with a Buncefield type scenario, then a front room fire, a one-room fire, almost pales into insignificance. And I think any emergency responders would do the same. So we're all taught now to do immediate dynamic risk assessments, and when you do it, the magnitude of this incident was such, four-storey office block on fire. No, we're not going to particularly worry about that for now. That was the dynamic risk assessment that we're involved in, so our officers and myself at the scene could almost ignore what would normally be a very, very serious incident. Some of the impacts, before I get on to dealing with actually how we dealt with the incident, some of the impacts, such as a smoke plume, had never been seen in the United Kingdom before. We had a smoke plume that over 130 miles in width, running from perhaps about Oxfordshire through to Essex, and being told by those in the know through Gold Command that within 48 hours it could be over the Iberian Peninsula. So we're talking with something that a smoke plume that had significant impact, and one of the planning scenarios that we had to be confronted with was this smoke plume dropping on the population, young children, elderly, asthmatics, other vulnerable people being affected health-wise by this. Now, how do we deal with the incident? In the traditional command method, gold, silver, bronze. Gold Command, working from the top, was set up at Welwyn Garden City Police Station, Welwyn Garden City Police Headquarters, which is Hertfordshire Police Headquarters. We are coterminous with our police colleagues, and that became an important element of how we commanded the incident. Those that sat in Gold Command, and I did for a while, but the Chief Fire Officer predominantly, very familiar with our police colleagues, used to working with them on a weekly basis, used to exercising with them. At that Gold Command table with the various agencies. Silver Command, the next level down, which is where Fire Incident Command was. I spent a lot of my time there. The difference was that Fire Silver Command was in a different place to Multi-Agency Silver Command. Multi-Agency Silver Command was at Watford Police Station, and that's because the fire response was one step ahead of all the other response teams. I'll give you the example. Our bronze commanders were right at the front of the incident, right at the scene. There were no other multi-agency right at the scene, i.e. fighting the fires. Our silver commander, i.e. myself, was one step back, and that's where the bronze command for police, environment agency and other agencies was. So to address this, to ensure proper communications were had, it's a well-trialled and practiced procedure. We have a silver command liaison officer in the multi-agency silver, and I would liaise with that individual. And then naturally we had bronze command, and bronze command were in essence the leaders of the tactical firefighting units in the various sectors at the scene, or indeed the rescue sectors, which is where we started. So to deal with gold first, who was in gold? Police chairs gold, as it does in any incident in the United Kingdom. It didn't matter that it was a fire-led incident, police will always chair it, initially the Chief Constable, and then a range of either their Assistant Chief Constables or Deputy Chief Constable. Naturally, fire were there, predominantly represented by the Chief Fire Officer, occasionally myself and occasionally an Assistant Chief, because we had to rotate ourselves and consider our own personal resilience. Health, the health fraternity through the NHS, primary care trusts, Health Protection Agency, Strategic Health Authority, ambulance, they're all represented, and perhaps I may say so caused a bit of a problem in having so many health agencies sat at the table. And to be fair to our health colleagues, they're very acknowledging of this and taking action throughout the country now to try and get health representation through one voice at the gold table. Multiple voices from health is not useful. For example, Buncefield, simple question, what are the health risks to members of the public of the smoke plume coming down? On occasions we had different answers from different agencies. Not helpful when Gold Command is trying to take decisions about should we shut schools? What is the advice we should give? And so we need one voice. Also at the gold table were people that could be considered to be democratic representatives of the public, County Council, District Council, and then there were the specialist agencies, the Environment Agency, Highways Agency, the oil companies. Those type of people sat at the Gold Command table as well. And it's that table that took the overall strategic decisions. And by that I mean, did we put the fire out or didn't we put the fire out? Because we could have let it burn. Gold Command made that decision, taking into consideration smoke plume, the political fallout of things. To have a oil fire burning for perhaps 2.5 to 3 weeks, which is what it would have done without any firefighting action, is that good? One, for the public view. Why aren't the fire brigade? Why aren't the organisations doing something about this? There's the health issues, there's the environmental issues of a smoke plume of carbonaceous nature straight into the atmosphere. So there are a whole range of things that Gold Command sat and considered, and very quickly they came to the conclusion, which was passed to me very quickly, yes Mark, could you please put the fire out? The other option of letting it burn would have been far easier for me, standing back and watching it burn. But the information came quite quickly that the fire must be put out. Now, what else did Gold Command do? I mean, as I said, it is dealing with the strategic functions of that incident. And I, as a Silver Commander, and indeed the Bronze Commanders, are very much focused on the incident. Gold Command is focused very much on outside of the incident, as in what are the implications to other parts of the community, the country, what are the political ramifications, media, government. And one of the biggest things Gold Command had to deal with, and did from about 36 hours after the initial explosion, was recovery, the return to normality. How do we get the communities, the businesses, commerce, everything back to normal? The impacts of incidents like Buncefield are very obvious, or some of them are. That big pall of smoke, flames, destruction, damage, personal injury, those sort of things, very obvious. What isn't seen is the economic damage to the community, the economic damage to the country. Gold Command deal with these sort of things because they can. Gold Command's function is to think long and think wide and preemptive. Also, they do help with the incident because they can be a facilitator for large-scale resources, which they predominantly delegate down to the multi-agency Silver. But that's the type of thing they get involved in. Gold Command would end up briefing government agencies, and indeed the Cabinet Office was involved very much in this. But there are also 4 other government departments because of the multi-agency nature. We had road tankers, 100 road tankers trapped at the site because of the fire. So you've got the Department of Transport involved. It's a big environmental issue, so you've got the Department of Environment involved. You've got our own department, the Fire Service, that's local government, and of course, because of the health issues, you've got the Department of Health involved. So you've got this not only multi-agency goal, but you've actually got multi-government department involvement, all wanting briefings, all wanting information, all wanting to take decisions based upon what they're told. So Gold Command had to speak with one voice to all these agencies. And that's without the local government office as well. In my circumstances, Government Office East, being sitting at the Gold Command table and actually taking notes and sort of liaising with the Cabinet Office. The Prime Minister himself, Tony Blair, was taking direct briefings on this incident, such was the interest. And indeed we sort of found out later, but didn't realise at the time, the Prime Minister had conversations with his counterparts from all over the world, because this was a worldwide media event. Sunday morning, CNN, Sky News, BBC News 24 were transmitting non-stop, and it went worldwide. We didn't know at the time, I certainly didn't, sitting in my control unit at Hemel Hempstead, but there was a great deal of interest. Whether it was a slow news day, I'm not sure, but there seemed to be interest from all over the world. One of the biggest things I mentioned, Gold Command, was recovery. And recovery had to be done in phases, and the immediate thing about recovery was getting people back into their homes. Over 2,000 homes were evacuated, and they were evacuated for a range of reasons. One, safety, because there was uncertainty about tanks continuing to explode, but also smoke plume, and also devastation. Homes were literally blown apart, and people need to be rehoused. Gold Command played a big part in this. How do you suddenly rehouse 2,500 people, 3,000 people? And the only way you can do it is because of pre-planning. Hertfordshire County Council's emergency planning team worked quite extensively in planning for incidents of this nature, whether they have to rehouse due to explosion, it could be wide area flooding, it could be a range of things, but we are ready with centres to accept people immediately. They tend to be community centres or sports halls, those type of things. But how do you feed those people? How do you cater for their needs? Formula and baby's milk for youngsters, diabetics, where do you get their insulin from? Old people, medication, those sort of things have to be pre-thought about. And of course it was Sunday morning. Everything is shut. Okay, so those things have to be pre-planned for, and that's where Gold Command and previous exercising of that function comes into action. So, Silver Command. What was Silver Command about? First of all, I deal with multi-agency Silver, and it had very, very similar attendees, but the next level down to Gold Command. So again, Police Chair, we had a Fire Liaison there, not the Fire Silver Commander, that was the Incident Commander at the scene. Emergency Planners, Ambulance, Environment Agency, all the normal players. But the Silver Command multi-agency acted as a logistics centre. If I at the scene said, for example, I need some foam, and I had this discussion with Gold Command and my Chief Fire Officer, I need foam and I need lots of it. That's as much as I need to say. Gold Command then discuss the potential for where to get it from, and then throw it at Silver Command and say, get lots of foam. And it's up to Silver Command then to source it, locate it, get it in, the logistics. That's just one example, because in the incident we had to do such things as build a temporary road. We had to get convoys of foam tankers through the country. We had to organise exemptions for drivers' hours, because under the DOT regulations a driver can only drive so long before rest. Well, the fire wasn't going to put up with the rest. We had to have a continuous supply of tankered foam, which was actually coming from Bentham in North Yorkshire, because that's where our main supplier Angus had their manufacturing plant. So all those little things, and indeed in Europe there were some of the raw materials needed to come across, so we had to get exemptions for drivers' hours coming across Europe. All these sort of things had to be dealt with very often through government departments as well. It goes up the chain through our country to government, and then down the chain in other countries, to actually get, so you get a driver in France able to drive his lorry through his country to support an incident in this country. That was the nature of this type of incident. It was across Europe. And indeed, one anecdote is we had a ship of raw material, I'm not sure what material, for production of foam. In fact, I'm not 100% sure what goes into foam. But provided it kept turning up at regular intervals, I wasn't too worried. But that raw material was on a ship. It was bound for, my understanding was, the United States, and it was coming from Holland. Angus, because they were the suppliers, redirected that ship to the United Kingdom, and they said to put into Tilbury Docks. Tilbury Docks is only about 60 miles away from Buncefield, so ideal. Having said that, it naturally had to get up through to Bentham for production. But when it landed, it was palleted not for the United Kingdom. So it wasn't palleted in accordance with the United Kingdom regulations for the storage or the stacking of this sort of stuff. So the dock master or the harbour master said, sorry, you can't land that here. It's not right for the United Kingdom. So we had the incident potentially compounded by somebody who was actually perhaps doing their job right, but perhaps sticking to the rules a little bit too rigidly. So it took a phone call from the Chief Fire Officer in Gold Command, direct to our Minister for Fire, and our Minister of Fire, I don't know who he went to or how he dealt with it, but within 3/4 of an hour, that harbour master was told, I understand in no uncertain terms, that perhaps we will relax that provision and we will let it through, or won't we? And sure enough, I didn't believe myself that the government machinery could act that quick, but very, very quickly that was released. And that's how we had to have liaison to get things done. And that's just sort of one incident. So what was actually down at the site, and how did we deal with the incident? The site is provided with all the normal things you would expect. We had emergency water supplies, we had fixed foam installations, we had a site control centre, everything that we would possibly want, and it had all been tried and it had all been tested. However, what we were confronted with was a site of total devastation. So the site control centre had been taken out. Now the importance of that is very often at tank fires, one of the greatest ways to fight a fire is to pump a tank out, take the fuel away and the fire will go out. Or indeed on occasions, the best way to cool a tank is to pump it full of fuel, because the tank will be cooler with fuel in it than just the vapours. But because the site control centre had been blown up, then it actually was taken out. We had no facility to do that. All the fixed installations, those are the sort of foam monitors and the foam spray projection systems on the tanks, were all devastated. They were twisted, gnarled, pulled off the tanks, so we couldn't use those. There are tank spray systems for cooling adjacent tanks. Again, all gnarled, twisted and broken. Even if they were in place, there's a water system around the site, a fire main, and this is supplied by fire pumps and pump houses, all blown up, all taken out. It was one of those situations where if it could go wrong, if it could be blown up, then it was. If I created an incident or an exercise, created an exercise for my crews and said, you're going to turn up and there's going to be no emergency water supplies because they've been compromised by either oil pollution, or you can't get to them because trees have blown down over roads, all the fixed installations are going to be blown up, and by the way the site control centre is going to be taken out, I would without any shadow of a doubt and would accuse myself of being unrealistic and going into exercise scenario and just doing things for the sake of it. Well, we were confronted with something that was that and more. We had 2 of our access roads to the site denied to us because the trees were blown down. Every pothole within, every manhole, within half a mile was blown off. Devastation so widespread that pieces of concrete, metal were across all the roads. We couldn't get close enough with our fire appliances without clearing the roads. So that all these things were put in front of us that, to be honest, we'd never catered for and we hadn't considered. But our crews and our responding officers just had to deal with it as they saw it and get on with it. So what was the first task that we had to do? And this was, I arrived at the scene perhaps 3/4 of an hour after the initial explosion. The fire was, in essence, a self-contained element of the incident that wasn't perhaps going to spread too much further. We had to stop it spreading, so some emergency sort of immediate cooling jets were put in, but basically the fire could almost be ignored. The devastation and destruction of buildings is what focused my mind. At the time we thought we had hundreds of fatalities and maybe even thousands of casualties, because the buildings that were destroyed were extensive. We're talking 3, 4, 5 stories, hundreds of metres square, housing in a normal working day. The Mayfield area of Hemel Hempstead has about 25,000 people working to within 500 metres to 1,000 metres of the site. So we're talking quite a developed commercial area. So I had to set up search sectors, and all these buildings had to be searched. And they had to be searched in such a way as within safety of the crews. So that was the focusing of the mind. The buildings were of such devastation that you couldn't walk around them anyway. You couldn't actually get into them in any great safety, and firefighters' safety was potentially being compromised just by searching buildings. Cars were another big issue at the site. We were confronted in the general area with 100+ cars that were in such state that you couldn't recognise their brand or their markings. And it wasn't just the fact they'd been thrown around by the explosion, it was the overpressures that actually just buckled cars in as though they'd been to a scrap plant and had been crushed. Now, every one of those cars could have had somebody in it, and they all had to be located and searched. Again, it was Sunday morning, so Saturday night, now we know, people used to park their cars in this area, go out in the town in Hemel Hempstead and get a taxi home and come and pick the car up the next morning. So there were far more cars than people there, but we didn't know this at the time. On the site there were 50 or 60 cars, but we could only find 6 people when we turned up. So trying to square the amount of people with the amount of cars was one of our major priorities. Sunday morning, a couple of minutes past 6, there were some people in some of the buildings, but because the backs of all these buildings backed onto Buncefield, those that were in the buildings were security guards who tended to have their station at the front of a building, anybody accessing the building. So they were protected by the building. So they were shaken around and bits and pieces and false ceilings may have fallen down, but they're in general terms able to walk, or maybe some of them run, out of the building. Cuts, bruises, scrapes, perhaps some psychological damage to what the hell's happening. But in essence there was no injuries. Absolute miracle. Absolute miracle. If the same thing had happened at 10 o'clock on a Monday morning, I would have been confronted with hundreds and hundreds of fatalities, I have little doubt, and we'd have been picking body parts out of those buildings for the next number of weeks, and casualties into the thousands. I've got little doubt whatsoever. I mentioned modern buildings being shredded. I'm obviously saying this so you've got a record on your camera for you, but you show this photograph and it shows you how modern buildings are just shredded. That's the actual exit for an explosion there. It went in the other side and came out the side that you're looking at, and just takes the side of the building out and shreds sheets. Like that, and just shreds it. Bricks and mortar tend to be explosion resistant more than the modern construction. Yeah, well, glass-fronted buildings cause us problems in various ways. One, you get the immediate shattering of glass, but also when the glass-fronted buildings in fires, for example, when the fixings for the glass melts, you get a planing sheet of glass coming down, catching the breeze and flying. And if it hits somebody, it just cuts them in half. So these glass-hung front buildings cause problems to fire and rescue staff. Apart from the glass shattering issues, if they fall apart in a very dangerous manner. So once we'd dealt with the search and rescue, And I say dealt with because the final casualty was identified, the final missing person was identified on the Wednesday, so that's 4 days later, because the police had to open a missing persons bureau, because the moment you have an event of this nature, anybody that's not turned up at home, for whatever reason, and bearing in mind this was a Saturday night, Sunday morning, people out in the beer, people having a good time, perhaps individuals have been out and met somebody for the first time, put it that way, and hadn't perhaps returned where they would normally be expected to return. You have an explosion of this nature and people think they're missing. So they ring into the police and they report them missing. Like I say, it took 4 days to finally locate all those people that have been reported missing. But dealing with the fire then came to the fore once we were satisfied that we weren't dealing with mass casualties and mass fatalities. So then it's, how do we deal with a fire of this nature? What are the resources that are needed? What are the logistics wrapped around it? And that was, I suppose, one of my prime tasks, is to plan for dealing with putting the fire out. Gold Command gave me the instruction, yes, put the fire out, thank you very much. I then had tactical planning teams, how much foam, how much water, how are we going to get it to the scene, how do we turn the foam and the water into finished foam, how do we apply it, how many people do we need, where are we going to get the water from. All these type of things had to be worked out. And one thing with foam firefighting is that you don't start until you can finish, because the foam, in general simplistic terms, has to exclude the oxygen from the fire. You basically flop foam on top of the fire and let it run across and exclude the air. But the moment you stop applying it, it can burn back, and as soon as the air gets in there, it reignites. So you must have enough foam to completely blanket whatever it is, and have enough to carry on applying to maintain the blanket. So you cannot run out of foam. So one of the things you must do is ensure a continuous and adequate supply of foam, and make sure you've got enough water, equipment and staff to apply it. That was the logistics of dealing with this incident, and something that probably had never been done in the UK before. So was I trained to do it? Were my staff trained to do it? Well, not specifically, no. But we'd been trained for multi-agency, we'd been trained for large incident, and all the way through our careers we've been trained to deal with whatever's put in front of us and innovate, to do our best with what we've got, and that's what we did. Unfortunately, in my humble opinion, the best we could do was more than adequate for this incident, and we managed to contain the largest foam attack within the United Kingdom and extinguish the fire in a little over 60 hours. And that was 20 tanks. And there are plenty of examples of a single tank being alight for far longer than that, and yet we managed to extinguish it in 60 hours. And I suppose I'm quite proud of that. I'm quite proud of how Hertfordshire Fire and Rescue Service staff, and indeed staff from 31 other fire and rescue services throughout the country, actually reacted and really pushed themselves quite seriously to get that done. And I mean pushed themselves physically and mentally, because we're trying to deal with things that we'd never been confronted with before. Both myself from a planning and command situation, but even down to the firefighters that were dealing with pieces of equipment in manners that they hadn't dealt with it before. One of the main ways we were able to deal with the incident was high volume pumping. Now, this is equipment that was supplied to us by the government under the New Dimensions programme, and this is a programme that resulted out of 9/11 really. What are the new threats to the country? And some of the new threats are contamination of water supplies, incidents that mean we need to move large amounts of water around the country, or indeed use large amounts of water for firefighting, or large area flooding, pump water and those sort of things. And so central government supplied the United Kingdom fire services with high volume pumps. Without them, I'm not sure, in fact I'm quite sure actually, we couldn't have dealt with the incident as effectively as we did. Hertfordshire has one high volume pump, and that's stereotypical for the United Kingdom fire services. There's one or two per service. But what we did, we brought them all together from across the country, and this was a coordination through our National Coordination Centre in West Yorkshire. West Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service coordinated that. 31 different fire and rescue services coming together. The use of 16 high volume pumps to supply what was 2 million litres of water an hour for firefighting. Just for the foam we needed 32,000 litres of water a minute, just for firefighting. That's not for cooling jets, that's just for firefighting. How much water is that? That's an awful lot of water. And we are fortunate that we were able to identify a water supply that had about 35 million litres in it. The water supplies on site couldn't be used. Compromised by the explosion. Compromised by access problem. Compromised by having 20 burning tanks next to them, which made it rather hot to get to. So our high volume pumps, they had to be craned into position because the water supply we used was actually away from a road. It wasn't a designated emergency water supply. It was what I call a random water supply that actually was a lake in the winter, fortunately December, the winter, and during the summer it was dry. It was a balancing tank for the local geography to take runoff, but fortunately it was there. And so we used our submersible pumps to actually supply water through 6-inch or 150mm diameter hose for about 1.5 kilometres towards the incident, and then it was redistributed on the site. The site became obviously very congested with hose lines and hose pipes, staff, equipment, and it's difficult to describe what it's like to deal with a fire when 20 tanks are alight. Everything is bent, it's twisted, it's on fire, visibility is compromised by smoke, you've got the heat factor, radiated heat. You basically have to be there to experience it. Now there are some photographs which can be shown which demonstrate tankers trapped in the scene. Now actually Buncefield supplies about, I believe it's the 5th biggest fuel depot in the United Kingdom. So because it's the 5th biggest and there are others, the United Kingdom will sort of function with Buncefield out of operation from a road tanker point of view and from a petrol station point of view. Heathrow's a separate story. But what compromised UK PLC's ability to function was the tankers that were trapped on the site. Approximately 100 tankers trapped on the site. Sunday morning, 6 o'clock. Tank drivers either hadn't come to work and they were stored for the weekend. So it's probably one period in the week when there was the least activity by road tanker, because it was a 24-hour operation. So at one stage, I think was the Tuesday, it was bring everything to a halt, and the priority, which came from central government, was get those tankers out. It wasn't just a matter of driving them out, they all had to be inspected by the HSE to make sure they were sound. The ones that had the windscreens broken had to be replaced. Keys, could you find keys? If you couldn't, get new keys, new barrels for them, get them moved that way. I mean, were the brakes safe? Were the tankers actually safe? Were they compromised by the explosion? There a whole range of things that had to be done to get them out. And so finding the driver's hours, those sort of things. So that was another thing that Silver and Gold Command organised. And then the instant command at the scene then had to make sure access to the site, stop firefighting operations, but stop it in a way that we weren't going to go backwards and the tanks reignite. So it was a balance between satisfying demands from others, i.e. central government in this case, against the demands of the scene, which was to put the fire out. All things the instant commander has to contend and plan for. The weapon of choice at the scene was large monitors for applying foam, 6 guns and foam bowsers. The 6 gun will deliver 25,000 litres of water and 1,000 litres of foam concentrate a minute to produce an awful lot of foam. Foam bowser is more mobile and can go around the scene, but nevertheless uses a lot of water and a lot of foam concentrate. We basically put the fires out over that 60 hours utilising large-scale foam monitors. I probably used 45 seconds to describe how to put an oil fire out using foam in something that took 60 hours. One of the things is forgotten is actually maintaining that foam blanket afterwards. And medium expansion foam can be used with medium expansion foam monitors just to continually cover the area in foam. I mean, some of the stats: 32,000 litres of water a minute, 1,200 litres of foam concentrate a minute. Injuries, there were about 60 members of the public injured, but there were small injuries, flying glass, masonry, those sort of things, nothing substantial. Firefighter injuries, there was about 30 firefighters injured, but nothing of any consequence. Slips, trips and falls basically. The whole site was covered with debris, making it difficult to move around, and then it became covered in oil product water runoff and foam, obscuring where to put your feet. So it was natural that we had those slips, trips and falls. But again, nothing too desperate for the firefighters. We use 786,000 litres of foam concentrate. That's an awful lot. And if you think one foam tanker, the biggest foam tanker is 40,000 litres. And then whether it was in foam tankers or what we call industrial bulk containers, IBCs, in 1,000 litres, it's an awful lot to get there. And we had that brought to us within the first 3 days, continuous supply. 53 million litres of water used. We had water recycling systems across the scene, so we used as least water as possible because we were always conscious of runoff. The main problem I had in the whole of the incident was water runoff and containing it. I was quite clearly told by Gold Command my main priority was contain water, contain contamination. Another thing that compromised ability to plan was that aquifers for North London's water sat directly under the site and around the site, and the substructure of the earth and ground around Hemel Hempstead is chalk, very absorbent. If significant contamination got into the local geology, it was there forevermore, and water supplies for North London would be compromised. So probably 80% of my planning and my planning team's efforts were directed at preventing water runoff. And this was done through a range of things: prudent use of water and foam monitors, but also capturing water, recycling water, those sort of things. We had over 750 individual appliance movements. We had over 3,500 individual firefighter attendances at the site. And those 3,500 firefighter attendances were through over 1,000 different staff. 25 firefighting appliances at any given time at the height of the fire on scene. We had about 60 million litres of oil product on fire at the scene, with another 40 million litres that could have caught fire that we managed to prevent spread to. But some of the logistics, when you have 1,000 members of staff over a 4-day period, how do you feed them? How do you actually cater for their rest and welfare? Basic human provisions. 1,000 staff, toilets. How do you provide toileting facilities? This is where Silver Command comes in. Portable toilets. Catering. We ended up having a burger van. Might not be the most glamorous of catering, but if you have a burger van on site for 24 hours a day, as we did, for 26 days, then you get a large bill from that burger van, and I suppose a very happy burger van owner. But we had burger van on site, like I say, for 26 days, bearing in mind this is over the Christmas period as well. And so those are some of the logistics that aren't thought about for a wide area and longevity incident. So, incident dealt with, then what? Then comes the things that I think in any large incident, in any multi-agency incident, you have to have a mind on right from the very start. Investigation. Could it be, and it could be, public inquiry, health and safety executive, own internal, police, you name it, a whole range of inquiries, and you need to be ready for it. Decisions have to be logged and recorded. And what we've learned from Buncefield is not only the decisions, but the rationale for the decision. Why did you take the decision? Record rationale as well as actual decision. This incident has been examined extensively by the Health and Safety Executive, set up an independent inquiry chaired by Lord Newton of Braintree, who's actually ex-MP, and recognising more as Tony Newton MP, and was leader of the House of Commons at one stage. But the investigation has been put into many streams, and they've reported on quite a few areas, but they haven't as yet said too much about the human factors involved. They've reported on the mechanical factors. They've reported on the fact that 300 tonnes of unleaded fuel escaped because it was pumped into a tank for perhaps up to 3 hours after it was full, so it escaped. The HSE has published documentation on this, but they've not said too much about the human factors, so they're still yet to report. So what did happen? Tank 912 was being filled from the northeast and the northwest through the night with unleaded fuel, and it became full, and for various factors the alarm systems were either not working or ignored, I'm not sure, But anyway, 300 tonnes of unleaded fuel cascaded over the top of the tank into the bund and naturally vaporised, creating a gas cloud some 400 metres in width. The gas cloud ignited and created the explosion that caused the devastation. What does it look like when a gas cloud builds up? Well, petroleum vapour is all but invisible to the human eye. You might see some shimmering, but that morning it was 0 degrees C. It was a beautiful, still winter's morning, clear skies. So unfortunately for the scene, the gas cloud just sat there. It was going nowhere. So what does it look like when it builds up? The gas cloud, you can see water vapour condensing because of the gas cloud and because of the ambient temperatures. So when you look at the gas cloud building up, what you actually see is water vapour building up. And that water vapour is actually the extremity of the gas cloud, so you can actually see what the size of the gas cloud looked like. And it creates a reservoir over the car parks in the adjacent area. It contained the gas cloud, and so when the explosion came, there were great concentrations of the petroleum vapour that could actually explode.
Just on that, I mean, isn't it extraordinary that there was no device to detect that?
Well, one of the recommendations from the review is there should be gas monitoring equipment. The only places there are gas monitoring equipment are around such things as LPG containers and gas storage, because they're expecting gas leak, therefore there's gas. I suppose you will always have a smell of petrol, a smell of diesel in any fuel terminal. Natural. So I'm not sure, again, I'm not technically qualified to comment, but there weren't anything to detect a leak of gas. So, what are the considerations for learning? And there are many, and they can go down to the real detail considerations, all the bigger stuff. And to be honest, I tend to concentrate on the bigger stuff, really. Hertfordshire Fire and Rescue Service has produced a report which covers all of these, which can be obtained from the stationery office. That's my little advert there. But they market it for us. We put together an extensive team to review this incident and to capture the lessons, not just for us, but I think for the wider audience in the United Kingdom, and indeed, as I subsequently found out, the world. The whole world is interested in this from an emergency responder point of view. And indeed, I suppose for those of you watching me now, the only reason that you're watching it is because it's recognised that there's a range of learning and a range of things to be gained from spreading the news, which is why I'm more than willing to spread it. This type of incident really brought home, like many large, wide-scale incidents, it's all about logistics. It's all about managing logistics over a sustained period, and whether that's going to be an explosion of this nature, whether it's a big search and rescue, whether it's flooding, whether it's just about anything that's over a long period of time or a wide area, it's about logistics. How do you control logistics over a long period, whether that's logistics of the people? How do you feed people? How do you rotate people so they don't get tired? How do you rotate commanders, somebody like myself, and still get continuity of command? How do you rotate gold commanders and get continuity of command? So these are the things that need to be considered. Some of the things that have to be considered are, this is visual and the media will be there. It will be transmitted live. That will get a lot of interest. Interest will generate the I want to go and have a look syndrome. Whether that's I want to have a go and look from members of the public that have to be controlled, or the I want to have a go and look colleagues within whatever emergency response wanting to help. If you're wanted to help, you will be asked to come. I would suggest to other emergency responders, do not attend unless you're asked to. We did have some freelancing which caused us problems. The environment, it's becoming a big issue, has been for a long time. But environmental issues, as we know, carbon footprints, those sort of things, well, there's no bigger carbon footprint than 60 million tonnes of carbon on fire, which is in essence what a fuel tank fire is. So when the environment gets involved, whether that's through environmental emission, i.e. smoke plume, potential contamination of water supplies, earth, ground, those sort of things, it's a big issue. It's not only a big issue to public, it's a big issue to politicians. It's a big issue to action groups, to pressure groups. So the environment will be a big factor on decision makers and command decision makers. The media. The media will have an interest. The media need to be fed. Do not ignore them. Because if you ignore them, they will be a pain to you. They will demand things, so try and give them what they want. Try and give them the story they're looking for. They want a story, that's what they want. So give them a story. They will be very satisfied with a story you give them. So give them the facts, give them the figures. Put up people to talk to them. Put up for interviews, live interviews. As I did personally on the site, give them a guided tour in safety obviously, but give them the pictures, give them the close-up stuff. They will come, they will look. You have to manage it. They will syndicate. They're used to that. So you have one television crew, one radio crew, and one tip we certainly learnt and used. Always include the local. Get the local paper. Get the local radio. You might not have to work with the BBC or News 24 or Sky for the next 10 years, but every week you're going to be working with the local papers and the local radio, so get them in as well. They love it. They're suddenly standing next to your Kate 80s and people like that, and they're getting the same status. Okay, so look after the local as well, and give them the story, and be honest with the media when you're sat in front of them. I think the public accept this is difficult, this is dangerous to say. It's difficult and dangerous, and my firefighters really are pushed. My firefighters really are working hard, but we're doing our best. So try and feed the media machine. It will certainly have benefits. Sky Television, News 24, any Gold Command Centre nowadays will have a big plasma in there. Use it. You're getting up-to-date information direct into the Gold Command Centre. Gold Command were actually able to see better pictures of the fire than I was as the Incident Commander. I was actually at the scene, but naturally, as I should be, one step back in a command unit. I could get in my car and go and see, but Gold Command had instant feed from Sky. Very good. One thing for emergency responders, which I didn't particularly take into consideration, where other agencies are not used to 24-hour working. Police Fire are. We're used to it. 365 days, whether it's Christmas, whether it's Easter, whether it's Saturday or Sunday, doesn't make any difference. We're used to being there. Other agencies aren't. We had a Christmas period, shutdown of 4 days. Well, we don't shut down. Police don't shut down. We just got people that are on duty. Other agencies physically shut down for 4 days whilst we were at scene. A little bit surprising to us. Agencies actually said, we'll see you in 4 days' time. But I personally was there on Christmas morning. I must admit I wasn't Instant Commander, but I did pop in to say hello to some of our staff. Some priorities for multi-agency incidents can be agreed beforehand. Example is, do we put a fire out? I would suggest to anybody that has an oil terminal now, that decision could be made. Let's assume you've got umpteen tanks on fire. Do you want to put it out? Do you want to let it burn? Take the decision now. There could be other things. Take a decision on what information you can give out to the public with regard to health advice. You could do it before the incident happens. There are certain priorities you can agree beforehand. You can do that. One of the reasons, and it is only one, why I believe this incident was dealt with in an effective, efficient and hopefully ultimately successful manner was multi-agency working. That multi-agency working in Hertfordshire is well trialled and tested through what used to be called HESMIC, is now the Hertfordshire Local Resilience Forum. Partners are used to working with each other. They've been tried and tested. They come together for exercises. And so when you come together for real, as we did at Buncefield, we knew each other. We'd work with each other. We knew each other agencies' capability and boundaries. People knew the easy stuff, such as fire and rescue. We deal with a fire. We will deal with rescues. We will deal with safety in the inner cordon. Those type of things can be discussed beforehand. Some of the learning for emergency responders are the incident doesn't finish when you go home. We were there for 26 days and we then wrapped up and slowly got back to stations and got back to headquarters and those sort of things. The interest goes on for a long time. I sit here now over 2 years later, still very willing to give information but still taking time out of your normal daily duties. It will take time, whether that's investigation, whether that's review, whether that's spreading the word, whether that's appearing before hearings, scrutiny committees, political forums, you name it, anywhere and everywhere. It will take time. And if you really do wish to spread the word, which we did from a learning point of view, then you're going to have to capture the information, and you're going to have to put in some effort to capturing that information. It doesn't just happen. So you will have to put some expertise in. Interest comes from various sources, but don't underestimate political interest. They are democratic elected members of the community, whether that's at a national level or whether that's at local level. Whatever it is, they have a legitimate and democratic right to demand information. Therefore, you're going to have to give it, whether that's immediately at the scene, or Gold Command, or afterwards. That interest will carry on, and could come from unexpected places as well. I certainly at the scene was confronted, and I mean confronted, by the Deputy Prime Minister, who just turned up at the scene on the Sunday morning or afternoon. I can't remember whether it was morning or afternoon. Suddenly you've got a Deputy Prime Minister who you recognise very well as John Prescott at the time, and he's popped in, I believe on his way back from his constituency to Westminster, and wanted to see it for himself, wanted to speak to the Incident Commander, and to, basically offer his support, which was, in some ways very good of him and very welcome, but in other ways a distraction. I was somewhat busy at the time, I've got to be honest. And that happens all the time. We had visits from Mr. Prescott, the Fire Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Cameron. That was within the sphere of the incident. Local MPs, and then it goes further. After the incident's finished, we fortunate enough to be fire responders invited to Downing Street and a whole range of things. These interests do go on, and it would happen for any incident. And health monitoring is another lesson to be learned. It will go on, and it will go on for some years. And those sort of things do take time.